Hello, this is Bribe from the Hive Workshop, once again bringing you a video about how to use GUI spell system. So the purpose of this video is to just make sure everybody has an idea of what this system is, because there isn't really a whole lot of feedback that I'm getting on it from the community. I appreciate the feedback that I've received so far, but it's mostly been a project that I've been just working on in passing. So what I wanted to show was the configuration part first of all. Since this is the first trigger, I might as well get this out of the way first. So spell system is primarily there to simplify your spell coding experience and to open up some new possibilities that weren't there before, such as retrieving the target information from an endcast event. So there's plenty of different features in here, but just going to start from the top. So spell dummy type. Let's start here. That's the first variable. This is currently set to dummy unit created by Vixorian, Anatarf, and Infrane. This is a universal model. It's found in many maps, and basically you just want to make sure this variable, when you copy it into when you copy spell system into a new map, make sure this variable is set to your dummy unit. That's the key. The dummy owner, neutral passive, usually you wouldn't want to change that, but it's been traditionally a configurable thing in other resources, so we'll do that. Spell interval, so how many times per second is this resource going to iterate over its periodic timer? So you generally want that to be no higher than what you would want your minimum interval to be. So if you're using a movement system, 32 times a second is ideal for that. So 1 divided by 32. That gives you 0.03125. And that's used in timer 32 by Jesus for Life on the Hive, on the helper.net. Okay, so configure default values for the unit filter. So this is an interesting one right here. So I've actually got a system integrated here that you can automatically pick units in range just by setting a couple of variables. I'm quite pleased that it turned out so simple. Basically, these are your default spell features that you would find. Most of the time you would have these on a spell that you created in object editor, checked or unchecked by default. So is the spell targeting enemies? Yes, then set that to true. Is it targeting living units? Yes, set it to true. Hero and non-hero, they should be treated the same by default. So they're both set to true. Allies, you can actually have your spell set to target allies and enemies if they're both set to true. Otherwise you would want one true, one false. Dead, same thing. You can have one true, one false, or you can have them both true. If they're both false, nobody's going to get picked. Flying units, I don't have an option to allow ground specifically, just because I've never seen a spell that only targets air unless you're using an ensnare or web ability, which usually you wouldn't use an entire custom system for that. But I can add it if anybody needs it. Mechanical, usually it can go either way on this one. And I'll show you in a moment that you can actually allow mechanical per spell, or any of these per spell, actually. So allow structure is false. I rarely see spells target structures, but again, you can configure that per spell to your liking. Magic immunity is something that you generally don't want to allow to be targeted by your spell. So we keep that false. Wake target. So if you pick a unit and it's asleep, should it wake up just because you picked it? I think that's a good idea. Object editor spells, including channel, which does nothing to the target without triggers, wakes the unit. So I think that's keeping it in line with Blizzard right there. Here's the custom script right here. So all of this is available to look over. I've commented things here and there. If anybody's familiar with custom script, they're welcome to go over this. If you're not, then don't worry about it, because you don't have to have any understanding of JAS in order to use this resource. I have made this all without any need for custom script. So, alright, so moving on to the next phase here. When you use spell system, you use typically a configuration trigger, and then use a trigger that happens when the unit starts the effect of the ability, or starts channeling, or stops channeling. And sometimes you even want something that that runs periodically, but that's actually not something I have a sample for because it's so similar to the event, and I'll show you why in a moment. Alright, so spell system sample configuration. This is showing what you can actually configure per spell. Now, the thing you must do, number one, you have to set the spell ability to what spell you want the event to run when it's doing an effect. So in this case, I've just given you a comparison, ability being cast, but ultimately you would change that to any other spell. So let's say you wanted to do animate dead. So you want something to happen when the hero guess animate dead. Yep, just like that. Spell trigger on channel, on cast, on effect, on finish. So you have to pick at least one of these, otherwise the spell wouldn't ever run. Basically, this is just saying at one point, let's say on effect, since it's the most common. So spell trigger on effect, you set that to another trigger that you have here on the left, and that's going to happen when an effect is run. So you just select up here on the list, and it's typically going to be one of these triggers that are appended with the gen part at the end. So hopefully this is clear. I can always go back and explain things better or make a new video. And so this on loop trigger, this is what runs periodically, and you just set it again just like you did with the others. Just set it to run a gen trigger just like any of the others. And this here is basically another part where you can configure, although in this case you don't actually have to have any of these, since they're all at the current same settings as the main trigger. You actually can omit every single one, and it would still operate just fine. It would inherit the settings that you had specified in the spell system configuration up here at the top left. But let's say if you wanted to actually change things, such as you do want to allow magic immune, or you do want to allow structure, you just go down here, allow structure, instead of false, just make that true. And so when you pick units in range for this group, it'll say structure is fine. So let's see. I change it back to false just because I'm just reverting things to defaults in case I accidentally save this map. I don't want to mess things up for the next time I update it. Spell use target group. Okay, so here's an interesting one. If you use the target group, you can actually keep track of units that are already hit by your spell. I choose to not. I choose to require the target group to be set per spell. Because if you're making a spell that doesn't need a target group, then it shouldn't be wasting handles like that. So it's just a little bit of a performance improvement, if you will. Okay, so once everything is set the way that you want it to be, then you do this. You run spell system ignoring conditions. You can also do checking conditions, but it's terrible if you do that. It's gonna waste resources. But yeah, that's the main thing. You make sure that you have your variables set up here, and then you run the trigger down here. Boom. And you've configured your spell. So now you just go ahead and move on to the spell that you want, the trigger that you want to have when the effect of the ability starts. Now normally up here you would have an event that says a unit starts the effect of an ability. But in this case, because we're running through spell system, you don't need any events, you don't need any condition to check if the ability cast is being handled correctly, because spell system does that for you. Okay, so these are the main variables that you can use with spell system from an event. So you have your caster, you have your cast point, caster owner, level, target, target point. I typically see these variables being set for every spell, so things like a level, while you can always get that after the fact, I just had it set like this into these variables, spell level. Equally, the level will actually remember what it was when it started being cast, and not what it currently is. So if you cast the ability, then you level up the ability, it'll still remember that it was cast from a lower level, so you don't get the effect of boosting your ability midway. That's how native Warcraft 3 abilities work, so that's why I kept it that way. So spell index. So if you've ever done indexing before, you typically use a temp integer, and in this case use a variable called spell index. It operates the same way that any other dynamic indexing variable would, but you don't have to do anything technical with it. I mean, it's here. It's already set before the event even runs, so it saves a lot of the complexity right there. It's like you've already got MUI just by having access to spell index. So whatever you want to store for the duration of your spell, just make sure it's an array and use spell index as the index of the array, and you're golden. You literally need to do nothing more than that, and it's MUI. Set spell time equals 2. So spell time can be anything you want. The range is between spell interval, which I showed you in the configuration trigger, which is set to 1 out of 32. 1 divided by 32. And so spell time should be set either to a minimum of 1 divided by 32 in this case, or as high as you want it. So let's say if you cast a spell 2 seconds later, you want to do an effect, you just set the spell time to however long you want to wait. And then this trigger here, spell trigger on loop, as you were also able to see in the last trigger, you can set it here in order to say, okay, when the spell time completes, this trigger will run. Now what's important to note is if this trigger, let's say you set it to spell time, spell interval, I'm sorry. So you want it to run really fast, like if you're doing a movement ability with your dummy, or if you're knocking a unit back. You actually have to set the spell time again from this trigger too. So if you don't want to keep it going, don't set the spell time. But if you want to keep it going, set the spell time again to the minimum in that case. And that way the system knows if you didn't set a spell time that you're done with the index, and you can and it can repurpose its resources to the next spells that need to be cast. Just a nice thing, keeps it out of visibility, so that you don't have to do all that messy indexing. You don't have to create any of those variables. You barely have to keep track of anything, in fact. And here we go. Spell target to spell target group. So basically, spell target group, that's what we covered earlier in the last trigger. You can just keep track of which units have been hit by this spell for this instance. Don't mind this. I've got enough battery life to finish this video. Okay, spell channeling. So this is one that you typically would only need to use from a periodic trigger, because otherwise you know whether or not the spell is channeling. If the ability effect has begun, obviously the spell is still channeling. But if the effect is finished, then it's no longer. So it's up to you how you want to use this, but you would never use this outside of a trigger that you run periodically. Spell completed was the unit stunned before it could finish casting. That would make that false. If the unit stopped casting and moved out of the way, that would also be false. But if it finished, completed the full cycle of the channeling, then that would be true. And this is only applicable after the spell is finished channeling, obviously. Okay, and so here's one of my favorite features of this system, the spell in range point. So, and the spell in range. So, spell in range point, you want to pick units within range of where. So set that to where you want it to be. Spell in range, currently that's set to 300 just for the sake of the demo, but you want this to be the area of effect for your spell. And so spell in range actually is kind of a hook. I use game variable becomes equal to or becomes greater than a certain value. So whenever you set this, I'm saying is that you are actually telling spell system to pick all units at this point with this range and apply the filter that you specified earlier, either in spell system config and or in your individual spell's sample trigger. So it will only pick enemies at this point and non-structure, non-magic immune, and adds them all to this group, spell in range group. Bam. That's quite a bit of time saved, and here's actually a block where I just kind of made a rough sketch of what it would look like otherwise. You would normally have to tell the group to be destroyed. You normally have to pick all these units right here yourself, and then you would have to do all these checks. Structure, ground unit, mechanical, magic immune, alive, and yeah, all this is simplified into these awesome 2 lines right here. It's very, very cool. And here's another feature. I'm not really going to get into this too much. You can read the comments for what this one does, just because my battery is getting low. And it's something that you'll probably use a lot less often than others. Same with this one for the most part, but I do want to touch on this a little bit because I'm quite proud that it worked out so nicely. So you actually have access to the hash table that spell system uses, just like this. So you want to make sure of that the value that you're storing into right here is spell index, and you're storing it into spell hash or loading it from, depending. So you basically have access to part of a global hash table. Since you can only have 256 hash tables, this is quite a good benefit here. So you don't actually have to create any hash tables for your spells because you can index them already, saving into the spell index portion. And this number can be anything you want. It can even be negative number. So you have a lot of versatility here. And when you're done with it, you don't even have to clear the child hash table. Spell system will handle that for you already. Just another way to save you time and save all the complexities there. So that's it. That's really what you would do for a spell. And just to kind of give a quick overview what it looks like when it's finished. This is the Big Dipper. This is the spell that I started with that made me end up getting inspired to write the system in the first place. Spell ability, you see how it's being set. Allow flying, yep, flying is okay. Mechanical is okay for this spell. The rest is mostly spell-specific stuff that is not part of the actual spell system. So spell use target group, I want to keep track of targets. On effect, on finish, I want events to run for those two things. And then we run spell system right there. Again, you just do this once all these other variables are set from your configuration trigger. When the effect of the ability starts, again, no events, no conditions, but this runs just fine anyway. So spell trigger on loop, we set it right here to Big Dipper loop. Spell time, that's configurable for this particular spell. So, but you see right here that it's actually being set to something above 0. Again, anything is multiple unit instantiable with spell index right here. Very good. Yep, here I'm using spell dummy type and spell dummy owner. Spell